Welcome back, students. Please find your seats. None of this will be on the test, but if I catch you snoozing in class, that's extra credit. Now, in our last session, we covered the basics of the foundations of Hellenistic philosophy, how it differed from and built upon the existing classical philosophy, and how it broke down into three major schools: Stoic, Epicurean, and Skeptic. Now, because the project of the skeptics was so different from the work of the other schools, we're going to sideline that work from today's discussion. Not because it wasn't essential and enduring work. The refutation and questioning of dogmatic thinking is arguably more relevant and pertinent today than ever, but because we're going to spend today's lesson comparing and contrasting Stoicism and Epicureanism. While these two schools share similar goals and thought structures, skepticism doesn't align elegantly, at least not formally speaking, and I don't want to misrepresent it and trying to make it fit into an inappropriate mold just for the sake of the conversation. So we're going to save that for another session. Again, I want to note that these are meant to be introductory surveys for the purpose of relaxation and learning, right? This is Hellenistic Philosophy 101. So I will include some recommended reading in the description for people who want to engage more deeply and really get into the nitty-gritty of how this all breaks down, which I highly recommend. For today, we'll be discussing the founders and values of Stoicism and Epicureanism, and we'll end with some metaphors and parables that illuminate just how we can use these ideas in everyday life, and I hope that will be helpful. I'll also be jotting down some key terms and names on my screen along the way, so you'll see those pop up. If you'd like to take notes or just see how they're spelled out, the spelling can be quite tricky when it comes to dead languages. Zombie languages, really, because we're doing our best to resurrect these ideas. I'll do my best with pronunciation, but I do invite the cynics in our class to roast me like Diogenes. And speaking of cynicism, I'll note that while some consider it a Hellenistic philosophy, because its origins are so deeply rooted in the classical period, I haven't included it in our larger discussion here. I think it's worth noting, though, that Stoicism largely descends from the Cynic tradition of rejecting social mores and seeking virtue and harmony with nature, which we talked a bit about last time. I'd say that Stoicism is a little gentler than cynicism, but it still goes pretty hard with its prepare for everyone you've ever loved to perish from the earth ethos. I give in, Stoics. Dantooine, the base is on Dantooine. Anyway, so with all that said, let's go ahead and get into it. To understand philosophies, it can help to understand their founders. Obviously, good philosophy should feel universal and enduring outside of the context of its creators, and it ought to reflect the needs and values of humanity as a whole. But to properly evaluate the values and the limitations of these ideas, it's necessary to know their origins. It's also just pretty interesting. Further, a lot of these guys have genuinely fascinating biographies. Their stories are just cool. I don't have time to delve deeply here. Um, However, I would particularly recommend reading up on the lives of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus if you enjoy historical biography. One was a slave and one was an emperor, yet they both became part of the storied Big Three of Stoicism, the secular trinity of philosophies most credited with popularizing Stoic practice. Notably, Stoicism's founder Zeno is excluded from this group. Zeno's writings were neither plentiful nor well preserved, and as a result, it's more foundational than widely known. He's the velvet underground of classical philosophy. You may not know many of his tracks, but you definitely know his vibe. The big three also included Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger, but I'm sure he'd let you call him Seneca. Seneca was a Roman philosopher, statesman, and a truly brutal dramatist. His tragedies rival some of today's most grim and gruesome A24 horror flicks and are truly shocking and engrossing. But Seneca's dramatic body of work isn't made of vapid provocation, at least not to my mind. It's sensational, but he also weaves and imagines myths to morally instruct and warn against the perils of unchecked emotion, passion, which is obviously core to the Stoic project. He understood that the very best way to capture human imagination was to first fascinate through theater, right? You learn the most when you're entertained. So this elegance as a storyteller only served to better convey his Stoic ideals. He lived from 4 BCE until 65 BCE and dedicated his life to the beliefs that people were resilient, that anger was a poison, and that time was precious. He spoke with a clear, accessible earnestness that was often gentler than some of the Stoics who followed in his footsteps, so he can be a bit more approachable for some readers and students. Seneca's life, however, was not without tribulation. He was exiled under very likely false and politically motivated charges of adultery under Claudius, but later returned to Rome as a tutor to Nero. If you know anything about Nero, it's probably that he wasn't particularly steady in his loyalties. He too eventually soured on Seneca and accused him of plotting Nero's assassination. Again, modern historians believe this allegation was also false, but Seneca was sentenced to take his own life nonetheless. His calm composure throughout the ordeal is depicted in numerous great works of art and enshrined him as something of a Stoic martyr, if I can say that. So, moving on, we spoke briefly about Epictetus in our last session. He was born into slavery around 50 CE in modern-day Turkey. He was a master of both brevity and shade. He walked with a cane and he broke absolutely no nonsense from his students. He and I have that in common. His unapologetic yet sarcastic and sardonic tone made him an entertaining and captivating teacher, and his origins as a slave gave his Stoic teachings a sincere and authentic gravitas. He implored people to examine their impulses through two central ideas: impressions, how we perceive, and volition, or prohairesis, how we respond to these perceptions. Epictetus saw Stoic philosophy as a way of life, not as merely an academic matter. He did it with a lucid good humor that made him one of the most relatable philosophers of his time and of all time. For example, on the topic of mortality, Epictetus tells us, "I have to die. If it is now, well then, I die now. If it is later, then now I take my lunch, since the hour for lunch has arrived, and dying I will tend to later." Lunch before death would have made really good merch for him. And although he had lived the literal experience of Sisyphus, the mythological embodiment of human struggle and toil without hope, Epictetus did not seek retribution or vengeance. He dedicated his teachings to freeing others from suffering and believing they could endure. They could get through anything because he quite literally had. I know it's mixing philosophies, but in my imagination, Epictetus is played by Rockfucius from Super Mario RPG. Never mad, sometimes disappointed, and willing to postpone even death for a little cricket pie. Marcus Aurelius was a famous emperor philosopher, but you've probably seen Gladiator, which is a complete and accurate portrayal of his life, so I don't want to belabor the point. Instead of a big three, the Epicureans really just... Oh, I'm getting word that Gladiator is not a complete and accurate portrayal of the life of Marcus Aurelius. I'm also getting word that you are not, in fact, entertained by my oversight. Okay, let's take that back then. So take two. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 CE and canonically known as the last of the 5 good emperors. The others were obviously Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Cusco circa his New Groove era. In philosophy, people often call him Marcus, which feels really casual and makes me feel quite parasocial about the guy. But for about 2 years in elementary school, I pretended Tails from Sonic the Hedgehog was my actual invisible best friend, so I feel like this is still growth, you know? I think of Marcus as my buddy, sure, but, you know, he was a real human person. Marcus wrote one of the most digestible and enduring works of Stoic philosophy. You've probably heard of it, Meditations. Written as a personal diary, it's intimate, personal, and has a different intended audience than most philosophical treatises. And I think it's this more human touch that deepens its relatability and moral authority. It allows us to see that even an emperor of Rome grappled with parenting struggles, the mandate to be a good man, and social pressures. It may reassure you to know that commanding armies and being minted onto coins doesn't inoculate one from being really, really annoyed by his loafing co-workers. I've mentioned he was seen as the last of the so-called good emperors. Notably, this term was coined by Niccolo Machiavelli, a person with whom nobody feels parasocially. He argued that the best emperors were the ones who were adopted and named heirs rather than the ones who were born into the gig. I know that the Nepo baby discourse feels very 2023, but it's actually so 1531. The point is that emperors like Marcus weren't born being told they were great, but came to be seen as such through their perceived wisdom and virtue. But beyond the sage leader, through his teachings we sense Marcus as a human, one with self-doubt, parenting struggles, leadership concerns, and a non-zero supply of social anxiety. He seemed to wrestle with his need for space and his desire to lead. Per Marcus himself, with what are you discontented? With the badness of men? Recall to your mind this conclusion, that rational animals exist for one another, and that to endure is a part of justice, and that men do wrong involuntarily. Here I sense him talking to himself as much as he's instructing the masses, though maybe that's just the projection of someone who practiced this very lecture in my shower earlier. The one thing I really enjoy about Marcus Aurelius is that he often acknowledged that others could be ignorant, unkind, thoughtless, or cruel, but he knew himself to also be imperfect and to be very privileged. He simply viewed the cultivation of insight and empathy as the duty of a good person, and certainly the duty of a good leader, one would hope. So that does it for the big three. Let's move over to Epicureanism and its key players. Romans love things that come in threes, but Epicurus was a Greek and had no time for triumvirates. And while there were many notable Epicureans, it seems fitting that a philosophy named for its founder was most singularly cultivated by that founder. And while Epicurus of Samos remains the most famous name in Epicurean thought, he was no loner. In fact, the very first of his 40 principal doctrines, that's right, 40, it's a lot of reading, makes him seem like a really good hang. So it says, a happy and eternal being has no trouble himself and brings no trouble upon any other being. Hence, he is exempt from movements of anger and partiality. I imagine this set in the register of Pedro Pascal in a Corona ad. La vida más fina. It's very, it's very soothing. So, 40 doctrines. Let's talk about the first 4, because these are often called the 4 cures, and they are somewhat comparable to Buddhism's 4 noble truths. You'll hear these ideas also called the 4 remedies, or if you're feeling ambitious, the tetrapharmacon. Tetrapharmacon. So, whittled down, they amount to this. Do not fear the gods. Do not fear death. What is pleasant is easy to attain. What is painful is easy to endure. You can kind of imagine gassing yourself up, chanting those to yourself in the mirror in the morning, like one of those like inspirational morning routine influencers. But they're helpful, right? Truly, Epicurus was a man who valued friendship and enjoyed the company and loyalty of many dedicated companions and disciples. Notable among them, Metrodorus of Lampsacus. I never know if I'm saying that right. Lampsacus. Someone will let me know, I hope. Hermarchus of Minylene, and Paulinus of Lampsacus. For them and with them, among many others, he developed his garden, a lush Edenic school where followers communed, cohabitated, and commingled, with some even forming families there. Yes, students, that's right, even lady folk were welcome in this garden, with brilliant female philosophers like Leontian getting Twitter-pated over foxy brainiacs like Metrodorus. To Epicurus, friendship and family were key components of human happiness, and it was this conviction that helped his garden grow and flourish, quite literally. If the garden sounds like a kind of sandals resort for the ancient elite, you're only a little bit off base. Perhaps if it existed today, we'd hear some very unsettling T-channel deep dives on its dark underbelly. But honestly, historians seem to agree that it was a pretty great place to live and let live. If you've ever played an older game by Natsume, you'll recognize their slogan, serious, fun, and that's how I've always thought of the garden. And really, it could function as a good slogan for the entire project of Epicureanism, serious, fun. The garden of Epicurus was notably democratic for its time as well, welcoming women, slaves, and people of many backgrounds to learn and flourish. Located outside Athens, the estate included a house and an actual garden, a very large one, actually. I think of it as a symbol of both hedonism and detachment, a place adjacent to society, but also independent of its mores, both an actual location and a symbol. It likely featured vast groves, as it was situated on the canals of the Eridanus River. According to Seneca, the following carving welcomed visitors to the property. It said, "Dear guest, here you will do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure." I want to start using the word tarry more. Love it. I have to give a small trigger warning for Gen Zers navigating today's real estate market. because Epicurus purchased this estate/earthly paradise when he was just 35 years old. But Epicurus wasn't necessarily flush with cash and likely acquired and maintained the property as more of a team effort. Born to working class parents, Epicurus ministered against excessive materialism and acquisitiveness throughout his life. You may remember from last time that he's said to have lived quite simply, considering a pot of cheese a delightful indulgence. In his will, he left provisions for his school, the children of his friends, and for plenty of parties and celebrations, especially, I believe, commemorating his death. So I think they'd have sort of an annual bash to remember him, which is much cooler than, a funeral, I think. So anyway, now we know a lot of hard to pronounce names. So let's shift our Iron Age gears and learn a lot of hard to pronounce concepts. And if you are Greek or got better grades in Latin than I did, forgive me. Fear not, however, as multisyllabic as they are, these ideas are actually fairly uncomplicated. They just sound intimidating. Remember, Hellenistic philosophy sought usefulness to the common person, and most of its key tenets aren't especially tricky. I think it's also worth considering that back then a lot was transmitted through oral tradition, and so keeping things relatively simple meant that it was easy for them to be digested, repeated, and spread around. So let's get to some of those key terms, and again I will try to show you how to spell them up on the screen as they come. Let's start with eudaimonia. It translates to well-being or living a good, meaningful life, eudaimonia. This means finding happiness through virtue and purpose, and you will hear about it all the time if you are interested in this era of philosophy. It was very important. Speaking of virtue, let's talk about arete. Arete, a word often translated as virtue. In a modern reality where virtue is often suffixed by signaling, I think it's worth talking about what the Hellenists really meant by arete. Today, an arete means the peak of a mountain, which nicely illustrates how it towered over ancient life. Beyond meaning goodness or righteousness, the virtue of arete is about being ideally suited to one's purpose. Inanimate objects could theoretically have arete in this space, like how a McLaren may be ideally suited to knock Max Verstappen off his podium for... I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get political. Anyhow, arete is the summit of excellence, the fulfillment of potential and purpose in humans. But you can see how your view of arete becomes somewhat conditional on your view of human purpose. It is easier to determine the purpose of a spade made by humans than a human. So here the Stoics and the Epicureans do diverge a bit. We see this also with the term ataraxia. meaning tranquility and freedom from fear and disturbance, ataraxia. An Epicurean sage might view this as the most desirable state of being, but note it also had to be sustainable, not the result of momentary wherewithal. It was also the state considered ideal for soldiers on the eve of a battle, both lucid and unruffled, and especially with the rise of Rome, you can see why this would have been applicable to many, many people and many, many families, as war was such an inevitable fact of life. Now, the skeptic Puranists believed this state could be reached through the practice of epoche, the suspension of judgment and certainty. Stoics sought it through virtuous living and acceptance of what they could not control. Ultimately, ataraxia is seen as the product of eudaimonia. Whatever the specifics, a good life should lead to freedom from worry. Now, it's worth distinguishing another term here, aponia. Aponia refers specifically to freedom from physical suffering, where ataraxia is freedom from mental and spiritual disturbance or suffering more generally. And to Epicureans, this absence of pain was conceived of as the highest bodily pleasure, as it could be sustained without stimulation, without anything external, essentially. Note this through line. Sustainable happiness meant far more to Hellenists, especially Epicureans, than momentary joy. It is the diametric opposite of today's dopamine clinging propaganda of wellness, where there has to be an input for every output. To achieve aponia, one must discipline their impulses and desires and classify those desires proactively. So, for Epicureans, natural, necessary desires are omnipresent and required for happiness and or survival. Other desires might be natural but ultimately unnecessary for survival. And finally, some desires are vain and empty to the Epicureans. The things we desire but conclusively won't enrich our lives in the long run. So I call these lotus emira desires. The classification of desires is obviously helpful in processing both physical and emotional pain. Just like we teach young children to name their feelings in order to process them, you may have heard the saying, name it to tame it. When we classify our desires, we're more likely to avoid the ones that bring us pain, like hangovers, stomach aches, spending remorse, or blazing fast car wrecks. Oh, my poor little imaginary Amira. So essentially, once we can recognize and name these things, then we make that pattern recognition a clearer part of our thinking, and it helps to mold our actions and behaviors. Now, while ataraxia is the ultimate goal of an Epicurean, Stoics might argue that apatheia is the most realized and desirable state of being. Apatheia. Both terms refer to freedom from suffering, but apatheia emphasizes the absence of passion or unrestrained emotion. At the outset, this might seem less satisfying than ataraxia. After all, passion can be fun, right? It may be hard to extract the modern definition of apathy from a term like apatheia in your mind, but this lack of passion did not mean a lack of vigor or conviction. It didn't mean not caring, and it certainly didn't mean you had to be a torporous hermit fettering all your days on Yukon solitaire in a cave somewhere. But you could be, and I would be. The Stoics speak of passion as unchecked emotional or egocentric responses to external events. So, no ants in your pants, no unheld horses, no flying off handles, no fever dreams, no uncooled jets, no lukewarm cucumbers, no fraidy cats, and absolutely no eager beavers ever. So, while the Epicureans would ask you to classify your desires, the Stoics would ask you to mind your virtues. And they packaged these tidily into 4 ideals. So these Stoic virtues are as follows: courage, to stand against injustice without compromising your principles; wisdom, sometimes written as phronesis. This refers to the wisdom to understand what you can't control and comes from Aristotle's mandate to use sound judgment in practical actions. Temperance or moderation, you'll see both used, not overindulging in pleasures. And the 4th one is justice, doing good works, doing no harm, and being a trustworthy citizen. This parallels the Confucian trait of benevolence, if you're familiar with it. Essentially, living in a manner that is fair and just within your world. Not to be outdone, the Epicureans had a 4-pronged virtue set of their own, the 4 sisters. These included pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure, especially ataraxia; prudence, very similar to Stoic wisdom. Prudence means acting thoughtfully to bring about long-term happiness; nobility, meaning honor and dignity to nourish self-respect; and justice, living fairly to build social bonds and avoid the anxiety of guilt and poor choices. You can probably start to see where these schools intersect and deviate. In our next session, we'll take some core issues and broadly compare the Epicurean and Stoic perspectives. But for now, it's recess. So grab a spot on the swings, crack into an icy fresh ecto cooler, and I'll see you after the bell. Play nice. For a good time, make it a new good time.